Good morning, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. We're going to give it about a minute here to let everyone filter in and get settled, and then we will start. All right, we're going to likely have some folks continuing to filter in over the next few minutes, but in the interest of respecting everyone's time and making sure we can pack in as much content as possible in our hour today, we want to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar on lifting the fog on climate change with our esteemed guest speakers, Leslie Hook, Rachel McMonagle, and Nick Turner. My name is Colby Reed. I am the Communications Director for the MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust. And I have just a couple of quick housekeeping items to cover before we turn things over to our panelists. First of all attendees in today's webinar have been placed on mute. If you have a question, please feel free to add those to the Q&A box, and we will walk through those at the end of today's session, as many of those as we can get to. We do have closed captioning available for today's session. If you'd like to access that, simply click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your toolbar. A recording of this webinar will also be available on our website in the coming days. We will email you all a link of that recording once it's posted, and we would welcome you to share that with as many members of your network as you would like, or that would take interest in this session. We also want to thank the Seattle Times for being our partner in this program, as well as the broader Lifting the Fog webinar series that we're hosting throughout the year. With that, I would love to introduce our moderator for today's discussion to get us started. Nick Turner covers climate change for the Seattle Times. He graduated from Seattle University in 2018 with a degree in journalism, after which he became a reporter and later a national correspondent for the Japan Times, where for 3 years he covered the coronavirus pandemic, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games, and the Environment Ministry. He was born and raised right here in the state of Oregon, and we are grateful for him today. I'll now hand things over to Nick to introduce our panelists. Nick?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
You're just great.
Awesome. Good morning. Thanks, Colby. As Colby said, my name is Nick, and I'm a climate change reporter for the Seattle Times. I'm really happy to be here today. We have two really cool guests, both of whom I think I have a lot to learn from, and I'll go ahead and introduce them. One of our panelists is Leslie Hook, who is the environment and clean energy correspondent for the Financial Times. She has reported from more than a dozen countries across Asia and Europe, and currently leads the paper's coverage of the global climate crisis. Previous postings include San Francisco correspondent, Beijing correspondent, and she's been covering resources and the environment for years now. Prior to the Financial Times, she was at the Wall Street Journal and the Far Eastern Economic Review in Hong Kong. Our other panelist is Rachel McMonagle. Rachel is a climate justice and land rights advocate whose work focuses primarily on nonprofit and U.S. government initiatives, as well as sustainable agriculture. She's the climate change program director of Landesa, and is currently working on developing the capacity for land tenure as a means to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Rachel holds a master's degree in environmental management from Yale and a BA from Oberlin College. Those are our panelists today, and I guess we'll jump right into the questions. Our first question is a very broad question, and I think that's what makes it so difficult to answer, but I'm hoping to throw this one to you, Leslie. It feels like we used to talk more about global warming or anthropogenic warming, but now the conversation feels like it focuses on climate change. Do you think the conversation has shifted? And if so, what is the difference?
Thanks, Nick, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Really looking forward to this discussion and also to hearing your questions at the end of the webinar. I think this is a really important question that you asked, Nick, the difference between global warming and climate change. It's also a question about what is climate change. And I'm a journalist. I'm not a scientist, but I do spend a lot of time interviewing scientists, trying to understand their research and trying to translate scientific research into everyday language, accurate language, and my articles that I write. And the way I think about climate change is, you know, if you zoom out over the past 800,000 years, the world has experienced about 8 cycles of heating and cooling, about 8 ice ages. And about 11,000 years ago, the world emerged from the last ice age. And we've had this relatively stable period of climate that has been the time in which human civilization began. And we talk about climate change in the modern era. That really refers to what's been happening in the last 200 years or so, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we saw coal, oil, and gas start to be used as the primary energy sources for the world, and they still are today. And those have emitted greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, leading to warming. And the world has warmed about 1.1 degrees Celsius, that's 2 degrees Fahrenheit, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution about 200 years ago. Now, going back to your question about global warming, I think of global warming as a subset of climate change because the climate is clearly changing, but it's not only about getting hotter. We also see ocean acidification. We see ice sheets shrinking. We see sea levels rising and all sorts of changes, heavier rainfall. So global warming is the most obvious trend in this period of climate change, but it's not the only thing that's changing.
So I guess one is part of the other.
That's how I think of it.
Thank you. Rachel, if you'd like to take a stab at that question, or the next question is kind of a doozy as well.
I was just going to add to that, that I think it's interesting to see how just the language and the vocabulary is shifting over time. And as Leslie's talking about, it's, it is warming, but it's also all of these other impacts. And there has been a push in the last few years as well to be shifting from climate change to climate crisis, to bring in more of a temporal element of the urgency of what's happening. So I think it's interesting to just watch how our language evolves as we learn more about the situation.
Thank you. The next question is maybe more about how our perception of climate change has changed. A lot of pop culture and media, we see climate change being depicted as this sudden disaster. One obvious example is a movie that I've always loved until I became a climate change reporter, The Day After Tomorrow. In reality, the impacts of climate change will take place more gradually. What are some examples of the impacts of climate change we're seeing or can expect to see in the near future?
Yeah, I am totally with you on those action movies. I think I see most of the impacts in 2 broad camps. If we have these sudden onset disasters like we see in the movies with the hurricanes and the typhoons and the blizzards and cyclones, they're more punctuated events and they're more shocks. And then you have these long-term gradual stressors that are building over many years, and you may not even track immediately that they're happening. And so that can look like, ocean acidification, glacial retreat, desertification, sea level rise. There's also this other camp with exploring how temperatures are shifting vector-borne illnesses, and that we're seeing ticks and mosquitoes in new regions that we just haven't seen before. And so these are communities that are not equipped or expected to deal with the impacts of malaria or Lyme disease or these other vector-borne illnesses that are now being faced with new public health crises due to climate change. And I think a challenge that we can have is often that we view these types of shocks and stressors as separate elements, when in reality they're layered on top of one another and they're all happening concurrently. And so just as an example, a community I'm working with through my work at Landesa is we have a project involving the mangrove forests along the Bay of Bengal. So working with coastal communities. And what Landesa does is we try to use land rights as a foundation for climate action. So the communities that we're working with, their livelihoods and their food security are often very closely tied to natural resources. And so they have the incentive to conserve natural resources and practice sustainable management. But if they lack land rights, they lack that long-term vision and that security in investing in their land. And so they may be dealing with soil degradation at the same time as sea level rise is gradually happening, you know, these long-term stressors that are building over generations, and then they're hit with a more punctuated event like a massive storm or a typhoon or a cyclone. And, you know, understanding how those shocks and stressors are interacting and how they can best be approaching really that constellation of impacts to be building resilience, and how with land rights they can have the long-term vision and the incentive to invest in their land and build that resilience. And so what we see from that is both that those communities are better prepared for climate change, but also that they're protecting these ecosystems that support mitigation and adaptation for much broader populations.
Yeah,
Well, it's interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Leslie.
Yeah, I was just gonna build on that and say that I think it's, you know, somebody else said this, not me, but it's not just climate change, it's everything change. Climate change impacts all facets of our life, whether it's our food, our health, you know, the air we breathe, and areas like land rights are very interconnected with climate change, as you said, Rachel. And I think that's why climate change is such a complex topic to start to deal with, because it does impact just every area of our life and our economies. One thing that struck me as a climate reporter is that we often know what the long-term impacts of climate change are, like rising sea levels, for example, but we don't really know when exactly these impacts are going to hit. Like with the heat wave and the wildfire season that the US experienced last year, that was, you know, far beyond what was really predicted to happen in 2021. We sort of got there sooner. But climate change is also a non-linear process. So just to give one example that a climate scientist once used with me, he said, it's a little bit like you're standing on an escalator, but you're jumping up and down. So the trend is the escalator is going up, but the top of your head might be going up and down. And that's a little bit how I think about things like annual temperature changes or natural disasters. You know, next year could be a little bit cooler. That doesn't mean that global warming isn't happening, because the long-term trend is very much there, but there's variability in the short-term trends. And that's what makes it sort of a bit hard to predict, you know, when things are going to happen, the magnitude of what's happening. And there is, of course, always natural variability in weather. And one of the most interesting areas of climate research right now is unpicking what's due to natural variability and what's really due to anthropogenic climate change. And that's a really hot area of research with a lot of interesting studies happening. And they found, for example, that the heat wave that happened in Europe in July, London, where I live, had its highest temperature ever experienced. That was primarily due to climate change factors, and it wasn't a result of natural variability.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. Attributive science and sort of finding the sort of thin line of causality between these extreme events and climate change. Being able to look at one heat wave and saying, all right, this is because we're burning a ton of fossil fuels. It's this exciting new branch of science that I think is definitely starting to take hold in the Pacific Northwest. And that segues perfectly into what I wanted to ask you both next is, you know, what can we expect in the near future? We're seeing headlines every day about extreme weather events. You know, what can we expect, and within, yeah, what parameters can we prepare for the near future?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question. I do think that the world we're seeing now is kind of the new normal. And even if we do cut emissions of CO2 and methane very quickly, there's not like a quick fix that will have an impact in the next like year or two. London, where I live, is introducing like a hose pipe ban tomorrow because we're in the middle of a drought. It's really unusual. The city is known for its rain. And I know that a lot of you, watching this have probably experienced a really hot summer where you live, maybe wildfire risk, depending on where you're based. So I think that impacts like that are really going to be, here to stay. And while we can't, as I said, we can't predict when extreme events are going to happen, we do know that they will become more likely, particularly heat waves, wildfires, and of course, hurricanes becoming more powerful as a result of climate change.
I completely agree. And that's, I think, a bit overwhelming to consider sometimes that this is our new normal, but there's so much power in recognizing that and being able to respond and sort of build our resilience and our preparedness and our expectations for what could be coming down the pike, even if we don't know exactly what it'll look like or when it'll happen. I think it's really exciting to see journalists like yourselves talking about some of these slower stressors and still, of course, covering these punctuated events, but also recognizing the diversity within the climate change sphere, because that increases broader public education and awareness of the impacts that we can expect to see. And that just builds more conversations and more perspectives and more people being involved in this conversation and our response to it.
Thank you. Speaking of punctuated events, very recently, President Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which I don't know about you, Leslie, but on our end, it was sort of a crazy news cycle for a couple of days, still sort of is. Maybe I can throw this to you, Rachel, first. What was your initial reaction to the IRA signing? What excited you about it? What concerned you about it?
Sure. And I think I feel like I've only scratched the surface on this, so I would certainly love to hear both of your perspectives on more of the nitty gritty. I found it to be a really exciting step, not perfect, but certainly an exciting step forward on both climate change and environmental justice fronts for the US. On the mitigation front, I think the connections between the IRA and the Paris Agreement commitments, it's great to see that alignment, with the IRA aiming to get the US on track to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030, somewhat aligned with that emissions reduction goal of 50% by 2030 within the Paris Agreement. So I think it's exciting to see that alignment and some putting that at least within reach and kind of exploring different approaches that we could take to get there. I think another piece that was exciting to me was the stress on inclusion of the private sector. At least in the spaces that I work, there can often be finger pointing or some blaming or exclusion of the private sector as key actors in the climate action space. And our interactions from Landessa's side, we have a corporate engagement team, and we've had really fantastic engagements with different private companies and different entities trying to advance climate action and work towards these ends of climate mitigation adaptation for the communities that they work with and along their entire supply chain. So I think explicitly calling them out and bringing them into the conversation, and I found that to be exciting. I think overall, it is tempting to pick apart, and I do want to hear more of your perspectives on that. But I think the thing that excites me most on a high level is that we do have major climate legislation that has passed, and we're talking about it. And the fact that we are having these busy news cycles and that people are disagreeing and bringing it up and discussing it, I think is in itself a huge step in progress. That our representatives found a way to advance this, and while it may be imperfect, I think just the fact that it exists and that we're moving forward with it is just an exciting new step for the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was a couple of high level things that stood out to me, just to echo some of what you said, Rachel. I think it will be a big boost for clean energy in the US with the wind and solar projects being able to get their tax credits for a much longer period of time, 10 years, rather than this annual cycle of like, maybe it will last a year, another year, maybe it will last another 2 years, nobody knows. So just providing more certainty to developers of wind and solar projects. There's also a credit for electric vehicle purchases, I think $7,500, and programs for lots of EVs in the US Postal Service and school buses, things like that, and support for US manufacturing of solar panels and batteries. So I think in a very practical sense, it's going to have a big impact on all of these industries, which are key for the US to reach the climate targets that it set. And Nick, I'd love to hear about your perspective on this too, because you've been writing a lot about the IRA.
Yeah, and I agree there is a lot of nitty-gritty stuff going on with the IRA that hasn't really been fleshed out yet, or time will tell, how many applicants or private sector companies are going to be interested in these tax incentives. But if I can add anything to what you two already said, I think the local context for me is really interesting, especially with what's going on in Washington State. As soon as January 1st, we've got sort of a bundle of climate policy that's going to kick in, including a statewide carbon market. In Washington, it's called the Cap and Invest program. We've also got a clean fuel standard, and then a different law that's targeting the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. So we've just got this huge bundle of state climate policy that's going to kick in right as the IRA money starts flowing to the states. So on one end, it could mean that state legislatures in Washington get a whole lot of money to appropriate as they see fit within the confines of those laws I just mentioned. Or, what I'm keeping my eye on is seeing how that money complements or sort of clashes with where those policies are directing public taxes. So it's going to be an exciting year in Washington next year for climate policy, for better or worse. And I think that's kind of where the IRA it's closest to home over here. The next question I have for both of you is also a pretty tough one. I think it's fair to say that there's consensus that climate change is real. I think even in the last couple of years, the conversation has shifted in what I would consider an encouraging direction. But debate remains over how much of a factor humans play in the impacts we're seeing on the planet. What factor do humans play in climate change, and how do we talk about that?
Yeah, good question. I think, as you said, there is a strong scientific consensus that human activity is the main driver of the climate change that we've seen in the last 200 years. And what's different in this climate cycle compared to previous cycles of warming and cooling is just the pace of change. What we're seeing is very rapid warming. If you look at the big geologic timescale of the Earth. And we know that from looking at past examples, looking at ice cores, looking at ocean sediments, and analyzing what those past climates were like. So what we're seeing right now is just very, very rapid compared to the previous cycles. And I think that what we're living through is certainly human caused. It's certainly anthropogenic. There is also some really interesting ways in which the planet itself is starting to respond to this warming trend. So as we've seen warming, which right now, as we mentioned, is around 1.1 degrees Celsius, that's already starting to create some feedback mechanisms where it's like a vicious cycle where warming begets warming. And that's, I think, one of the scariest, but also most interesting things that I've been writing about recently. Some of those feedback mechanisms include, like in the Arctic, you see sea ice reducing in area, so there's less sea ice, and as a result, the ocean is absorbing more heat from the sun because the dark colored ocean absorbs heat more easily, just like a black car gets hotter than a white car if they're sitting in the sun. And so we've seen the Arctic warm up about 3 times faster than the rest of the Earth, primarily because of that effect, and that has knock-on impacts on what's happening with permafrost, with habitats, and there's a sense of like the warming cycle sort of feeding itself. So a lot of scientists study this area of tipping points, and there's different tipping points in different parts of the planet, different ecosystems. But the idea is once those tipping points are passed, then we won't necessarily be able to do anything about it. We won't really be able to control it, or bring the world back to the state that it was in.
Leslie, it's just been really exciting to hear how you've been presenting everything, because I feel like I talk about climate change a lot, and I feel like the way you're presenting it has been really clear and really useful. And your conversation about the escalator, but jumping up and down, I think that's really helpful, because there is often a sort of this obsession around like, when is peak oil, or what are these tipping points, or if we're not hitting our predictions exactly as expected, then sometimes people feel like we know a lot less about climate change than we really do, or when we don't hit one expected bench point, then the rest of the research is false. And I think it is an evolving area of science, and having that flexibility of.
Oh, I think we lost Rachel.
Oh, okay. That's unfortunate. I think she'll be back soon. So yeah, I do really appreciate the escalator metaphor. I think I'm going to use that one in the future. Yeah, I mean, even in these questions, I think it's always been a difficult thing describing the scope and sort of magnitude of this thing called climate change. In a conversation about how this is affecting us, I think it's difficult to move past the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it's had on every facet of life. Back in 2020, you were writing about the ways COVID-19 was stalling climate change momentum. Could you talk a little bit about that? And there was data showing that lockdowns were improving air quality based on reduced mobility and use of public transportation, as an example. Did we see any lasting impacts?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think we're still, in a way, living through the impacts of COVID-19 on our energy systems and in our daily lives. In 2020, because of the pandemic and lockdowns, global emissions dropped about 5.8%, but then they surged right back up in 2021, rose 6%. So the decline in emissions that we saw during lockdown was only temporary. And this year, emissions could be even higher. So while there was this temporary environmental benefit from the fact that the global economy sort of came to a stop, it's been basically erased as the economic activity starts to return to normal. I also think that the pandemic, if in order to limit global warming, the world will need to cut emissions, but the pandemic was kind of like the wrong way to do that. There are ways to reduce our emissions. It doesn't mean everyone's going to be locked at home in that like lockdown mentality where you can't open your front door without worrying you're going to die. So that's kind of the wrong way to think about cutting emissions, or an unhelpful way to think about it. But we do see emissions increasing. And I think right now, given the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis that's consuming Europe, there is a sense that, this year is a year in which there's a lot of global problems. We see concerns about inflation, and policymakers' focus hasn't really been on climate change as much this year, 2022, as it was last year. I attended COP26 in Glasgow, and countries said they were going to come back with these new climate pledges. Most of those haven't really emerged so far this year. So it does feel like, because of the pandemic and other things happening in the world, leaders' focus has been elsewhere.
Well, you mentioned that emission reductions during the pandemic and specifically 2020 weren't necessarily the right way to do it. I agree completely with that in the context of COVID-19 and maybe even with COP. What kind of reflections did you have on the right way?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think the right way to cut emissions is in a way that respects people's livelihood, respects issues of justice and employment, and ways that can improve the quality of life for people that are living through it. So some of those ways to cut emissions that are the right ways, I think, can have additional benefits, like improved air quality, from stopping, if you use electric vehicles, air quality will in general be better than using diesel. Welcome back, Rachel. Than using diesel. So I think that policies that reduce emissions and improve quality of life are the way to go.
Rachel, we were just talking about how COVID-19 affected energy use around the world, well, specifically emissions and climate policy. Did you have any reflections, especially early in 2020 and after COP, about the right way forward, or how we're talking about that?
Yeah, I think, and I'm sorry for dropping off there. That is just the virtual world we are living in. I think what was interesting for me was looking at the response to COVID as somewhat aligned with, seeing how the public could react to the climate crisis as well, and seeing how there was a lot of power in the solidarity and the cooperation that we saw, but there was also a lot of division and a lot of misinformation and tensions between groups, both in the US and around the world. And so I think it was a bit of a wake-up call to sort of explore broader conversations around our preparedness for different events or different shocks that might be coming our way, and to explore how we could be better prepared for both the climate emergency and other public health emergencies that might be on their way.
I remember thinking that every day earlier in the pandemic, just, I wish the world would react to climate change as quickly as it had to COVID-19. Well, quickly in the broad sense of the term. And that speaks to another question I wanted to ask you both. And you both touched on this. Climate change is this monolithic problem that most of the time feels like it's, beyond our understanding. Sometimes it's just a sort of pie in the sky, world-ending thing. How do you conceptualize that, and how do you talk about it in a way that avoids, well, for one thing, maybe on your end, Leslie, reader fatigue, and on your end, Rachel, to maintain motivation to fight these problems?
Sure. I think for me, it's been an interesting journey with my career, because I was very in the environmental sphere, where my professional network and my peer group were all, biologists or ecologists or very environmentally bent people. And I was viewing climate change as such a nature-based crisis. And I ended up taking on a role within the American Public Health Association, and it was their Center for Climate Health and Equity. And so I was working for years with, it was doctors and nurses and public health professionals and dentists. There was a very active dentist contingency, and they were all really passionate about climate change and exploring how they could be talking about climate impacts with their patients and their colleagues, and how they could be making connections between the impacts that they're seeing in their practice and climate change, and kind of using their connection to the public as trusted voices and care providers to start broader conversations around climate change and different choices or policies and politics that could advance climate action, but also make us healthier. And that just really opened my mind to the variety of people who are working on this problem and the diverse set of expertise that is coming into this issue. And it's a health crisis, and it's a nature crisis. And it's, you know, as we've been talking this whole time, it does touch on so many different livelihoods and things that matter to people. And I think with that, it's just been really inspiring to see all different kinds of folks of the health sector and the energy industry and farmers and architects and artists and really across the board, people approaching this major problem from such different angles. And I just find that really inspiring and empowering, and especially when I think of the young people and how active and organized they have been in acting and speaking out on climate change. I think it's really emboldening to know that you are not alone in approaching this challenge, and we're all doing it in our own way, but there's a much broader collective pushing in the same direction. And I find that really encouraging.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I guess from where I sit as a climate journalist, I think of my job as it's not necessarily to solve the climate crisis, it's just to explain it to people. And I feel really inspired every day by scientists doing really interesting research or entrepreneurs coming up with some cool startup. Some of those might work, some might not work, but there's a lot of energy pushing in that direction. A lot of research that's, you know, uncovering new things, companies trying to figure out how to do the right thing, and policymakers trying to figure out how to do the right thing. So I think there are encouraging stories out there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You know, with COP coming up, or the next UN Climate Summit coming up in a couple months, maybe this is a good chance to look back at the last one. And this is a question for both of you. You know, what did you take away from COP26? What did we gain, and what did we miss out on?
Yeah, well, the UN climate summits each year, the COP summits, are kind of this pinnacle of climate action, where different governments and NGOs and businesses all come together to implement the Paris Climate Accord. And the goals of the Paris Accord are to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, or ideally around 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that goal, that temperature goal that's in the Paris Accord, is getting harder and harder to reach, frankly, as global emissions keep increasing. Each year that we keep emitting what we're emitting today, then the degree of cuts needed and the rapidity of those cuts just gets that much harder. And those temperature goals are kind of slipping out of reach, particularly the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, which some climate modelers think could be passed within this decade. But you asked about the COP26. So, you know, each year the COP conference is a moment for countries to come together and say, this is what we're doing. This is what we're all going to do collectively. Some years there's a bit of kind of like a blame game, or, I'm doing this, but you're not doing enough, or, it's always China's fault, or it's France's fault, or whatever. So there's some kind of unhelpful politics around that. And, the bottom line is that we all live on the same planet. So whether, it's my emissions or Nick's emissions or Rachel's emissions, like they're all going into the same atmosphere, and all countries do need to cut emissions. That's harder for some countries to do, easier for others, but everyone has to kind of pull in the same direction. And I think in the broader macroeconomic environment that we're in right now, with inflation, with war in Ukraine, with everything that's going on, it just becomes that much harder to get that consensus among countries to pull in the same direction. So I'm feeling a little bit pessimistic about what's going to happen at the next COP, which is happening in November this year. By the way, I see one question here, which is, what does COP stand for? Sorry to use that jargon without explaining it. COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and that means the parties are all the countries. I think there's 197 countries that signed the UN Climate Accord and are part of this UN climate change group, and so it's their annual gathering. Rachel, how do you see the COP process?
I feel like it's always bittersweet, and I completely agree with how you're framing that. There's so much energy leading up to it, and within the meetings there's a ton of energy, a ton of conversations, and a lot of commitments made. And then in the months following, there's a lot of doubt around what progress was made, what commitments are going to be followed through. And I think the way I view it is that the last COP in last November resulted in a number of bold commitments, and that in itself was progress. And I see this COP as really holding those parties accountable for those commitments that were made. And so Landesa is particularly interested in the funding commitments that were made towards the deforestation pledge, as well as funding that was meant to go to Indigenous peoples and local communities to support their climate action and to recognize their sustainable land management and how we've all been benefiting from their stewardship of these natural spaces and the mitigation that they have been leading. And so, especially from Landesa's perspective, we see land rights as a key component of that conversation, of ensuring that Indigenous peoples have legal right to their land so that they can continue this stewardship of these critical ecosystems and advancing mitigation. I'm also encouraged across the board. So this Conference of the Parties is for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but there are two other Rio conventions, and one is focused on biodiversity and one is on desertification. So there's the three of them. It's climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. And even in the last few years, we've been seeing a lot more alignment between these three conventions, and a greater emphasis on inclusion of women and Indigenous peoples and youth as critical actors across all three conventions. And so that's really exciting to see, as far as, we're thinking of governments that may be strained in resources and may not be able to, they may be juggling where to invest their limited resources on which commitment that they have made. And so the extent to which we can align these goals and support governments in seeing the connections between these environmental goals, I think we'll see greater outcomes and better follow through on some of the commitments that have been made. I think particularly with the deforestation pledge made last year, there will be even greater emphasis on the private sector participation in COP, which is a component every year, but often I think pushed to the side a bit. And I think they need to be brought in more as key actors that really control a lot of courses of action around emissions and potential mitigation.
Rachel, you just mentioned your work at Landesa and the importance of stewardship. Could you explain briefly what land tenure is and why it's important?
Sure. So when we say land tenure, we're talking about legal claim to the land that you live and work on. And so it can look like a variety of different things. It could be land rights for an individual or for an individual family. Other communities and cultures prefer to have collective tenure. So it would be a broader group of potentially hundreds or thousands of people holding one legal title to the land. And in other cases, it's depending on the tenure arrangement within a country and how the government views land as resource. It might be more resource access. So it could be the government providing 100-year leases to the land and the resources on it. And I mentioned this a bit before, but we see the intersection of climate action and the secure rights to land as just necessarily intertwined as far as encouraging people to have that long-term vision of investing in the land and caring for it. So I often think of if you rent your home versus if you own your home. And I think at least times when I've rented, I haven't really invested in the garden or painting the home or, you know, keeping it up to the best that it could. But if you own that, you can see a really long-term role for you on the land and the food that it can provide and the livelihoods that it can offer. I think there's a much greater incentive for investing in that. And so then the immediate communities benefit from greater livelihood security, and the global population benefits from the mitigation potential of conserving those ecosystems.
Well, Rachel, maybe I can ask you the follow-up question to that. You know, protecting the planet is a top priority, but there can be differing opinions on how to achieve that. One example we talked about earlier is about, well, prior to the panel, is about hybrid and electric cars, about how they don't use gasoline, but they do when you're building them. And the materials are often sourced in non-renewable ways. You know, there's a price to everything. So with that in mind, what do you think are the priorities we should have when it comes to protecting our environment?
Mm-hmm. It's a huge question, and there's really no one silver bullet to solving the climate crisis, or I don't even know if we should be solving, mitigating the impacts of climate change. And so I think I often get a little frustrated in conversations where we're debating one solution over another or encouraging one over the other. And I think it really does have to be a variety of solutions from all different sectors coming together. I'm really encouraged recently as people have been bringing in the land sector. So looking at agriculture and forests and land use as a key component of both sequestering carbon as well as reducing poverty. And I think for a while, our conversations around climate change were largely focused on technology and industry, and those are necessary, critical parts of the conversation. But to broaden that and really explore all the different sectors and all the different entry points, I think is critical to having multiple entry points into this problem. I think really at the local level, and this may have been brought up when I was off the call, and I'm sorry, but the power of just voting and recognizing that your values and what you're practicing at home can be scaled through policy and programs and through government investments. And so really just taking advantage of being a constituent in such a powerful country and making sure that your voice is heard and that your priorities are heard through that vote, I think is a really powerful investment, even though it feels, I don't know, it can feel small. I think that can be a really big shift in what can happen in your immediate community all the way up through national impacts.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's a hard one. I think in terms of what we can do as individuals, I would echo what you said, Rachel. I think vote, be civically engaged so that your values can be reflected in the community around you. Read educate yourself and others, talk about issues that you care about with your friends when it comes to climate. And then in terms of lifestyle, I think that it can be kind of daunting to think about reducing your own carbon footprint and stuff like that. But one policy that I think is always kind of helpful that I keep in mind for myself is just try and like buy less stuff, basically. And you don't have to be vegan or like take cold showers or wear a hair shirt, but just like consuming less things is really helpful for the environment. And on like a macro level, on the very, that's kind of in the small level, but on the big level, I think that that the world needs to cut emissions of CO2 and methane as quickly as possible to reduce the future level of temperature rise. And we also need to learn how to live with the temperature increases that are already built into our system and to, where possible, reduce the impact that climate change is having, particularly on the most vulnerable members of our communities and the people that are most impacted by climate change. So I think that, try to prevent future climate change by reducing emissions, and B, we all have to learn to live with the climate change that's already happening around us now.
Before we move on to the next question, I like how you mentioned what I assume you're referring to, which is baked-in emissions. Could you explain that a little bit, and maybe explain especially this idea that there's a delayed impact with fossil fuels?
Yes, that's a really good question. I'm going to have to caveat this since I'm not a scientist, I don't want to get this wrong, but the basic principle is that carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for about a century. So even if we stopped emitting CO2 tomorrow, existing CO2 levels are already very high, and they will continue to be that way. And some of the feedback mechanisms that are already happening, like what we talked about in the Arctic and the warming effect in the Arctic due to the melting sea ice, are also already playing out. So it's not like there's not like an immediate reduction in temperature. It's not like if we stop reducing, if we stopped emitting tomorrow, global temperatures would still keep increasing. They would just increase slower, and then they would stabilize sooner. And global temperatures will only stabilize when our human emissions reach a net zero. So if we reduce our emissions to the point where whatever we are emitting is balanced out by things that we could absorb through offsets or through natural processes. The planet does have the ability to absorb some carbon, but right now humans are emitting a lot more CO2 than what the planet can absorb. So that's one of the really challenging things about the climate crisis, is that it is kind of built in for the long term.
No, thank you for that. Thanks for letting me throw you that question. And Colby, feel free to jump in at any point, but I'm thinking I can ask one more question before we go into Q&A.
That'd be great.
All right. And this is kind of an overarching question. We've definitely touched on it already in this panel, but I think it's worth belaboring. Climate change can often make us feel hopeless or discouraged and even alarmed. What gives you reason to feel hope?
I think for me, and I'll keep it brief because I know we're trying to go to questions. Like I was saying before, it's really the diversity of people working on this challenge and the potential it has to really bring people together under a common banner of climate change is impacting all of us, some more than others, but it is a common enemy of sorts that I would hope could be a real unifier and bring a lot of people together to practice different creative solutions and different approaches. I think the other thing that gives me a lot of hope is how resilient nature is. And it's so discouraging to see the extinctions and the degradation that is happening, but to also be reading about how resilient so many species are, and how we've seen forests come back after nuclear bombs, and we've seen different animal species migrate to different locations to thrive in new environments. And I think there is a lot of lessons to be learned there, and a lot of inspiration to be taken in the extent to which we can push on nature, and it will bounce back to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Nick. And I'll try and keep this brief because I want to hear from you, the audience, as well. I think one thing that gives me hope is just how much climate journalism and environmental journalism has shifted in the time that I've been doing this beat. I started as the FT's, the Financial Times environment correspondent in 2018. And from then until today, there's just been a huge increase in reader interest, in my editor's interest, and in the way our newspaper covers climate change. When I started, I was the only environment reporter, and now there's actually 3 of us on this beat. So it feels like something that I've seen just in my corner, in my job. Climate change is very much embedded in the way our newspaper now looks at different industries and companies, and it feels like it's kind of across everything that we do. And so that's sort of encouraging. I do think that the way people are thinking and talking about climate change has really shifted in these past 5 years.
That is really encouraging to hear. I mean, from my own experience, I joined the Seattle Times in January as the very first climate change reporter. So possibly in a similar situation as you a couple of years ago. But yeah, lots of reader interest, which is very, very encouraging. Okay, Colby, should we jump to Q&A?
Yes, and you should see your first question in the message box to you, Nick.
Would that be the... Awesome. And I should be looking at the Q&A box, is that correct?
Look in the chat box. I messaged it to you directly.
Oh,
That's
gotcha.
Question 1.
Awesome. Thank you. Question 1. First question is about the timeline of climate change and sort of changing predictions over the year. Over the years, we've heard timelines for when we would cross the point of no return regarding climate change. For example, scientists in the 70s were pointing to acid rain and smog issues, and then said 1997 was the critical end date. Similarly, scientists said we would face catastrophic outcomes in 2000. Now we're hearing about 2030 and 2050. If I'm understanding correctly, I think the question is about, why are these deadlines changing? And does it speak to a changing in our understanding of climate change? Or, I think, as I might suspect, a reevaluation of our own efforts? Would either of you like to take this one?
Well, I think it's certainly true that there have been a lot of developments in science in the last couple decades. If you look at what a supercomputer can do today, it's totally different from what it could do in 1990. And the same with satellite imagery. So our understanding of the world's atmosphere has really improved over the past couple decades due to having satellite imagery of what's happening. And so there has certainly been evolving science. But the basic principles of climate change, that CO2 is a warming gas, that methane is also a warming gas, those haven't really changed. But what we are learning more about is the precise impacts and the physical processes on our planet that are underway.
To add to that, I think I think it's also, I guess, depending on how you are defining catastrophic impacts or losses, because we have been experiencing significant losses in biodiversity and, ice melt and other massive changes to our global ecosystem. So these things have happened and have resulted in what I think some would deem as catastrophic losses. There's also this need to have a new goal and have recognize kind of where we're at and what can still be done. And I think there's somewhat what Leslie was alluding to, you know, also this transformation of kind of the narrative around climate change of the ozone hole, and then it was the icebergs and you got to save the polar bears. And now it's much more of a, you know, an emphasis on people and health and the global south broadly, and these extreme storms that we're seeing more and more in the wildfires. So I think sort of the face of climate change has evolved as we've seen different impacts. And there's been a need to set new goals, whether or not we've kind of achieved our earlier set goals, just to keep momentum high and to recognize the opportunity that still exists.
Thank you. I'll go on to the next question. Can you speak to potential market-based mechanisms and supporting policies that might push company executives to be more aggressive on mitigation and adaptation measures?
Sure, I can start with that. Here in the UK, where I'm based, we have seen several mechanisms that are encouraging companies to be more aggressive in mitigation and adaptation. The UK passed a net zero climate target into law, so it has a legally binding net zero law, and it's also started doing things like climate stress tests on banks to look at how their stability would be impacted by future climate events. So here there are things that that regulators have done to provide certainty to businesses, and to start to provide an assessment of what businesses' exposure is to future climate risks.
To add to that, you know, on the other end, the carbon market and carbon offset market, as well as payments for ecosystem services, they have become so much stronger and more robust in the last several years of having different certifications and third-party auditing systems, that these are much more legitimate markets than they've been in the past. And so creating incentives for the private sector to be investing in those types of carbon mitigation opportunities, I think also holds a lot of promise for supporting communities that are experiencing the worst of climate change, as well as helping companies have an outlet and have a legitimate claim to some of these sustainability practices that they're interested in.
Great. Thank you for your thoughtful answers. We are out of time, so I'm going to throw it back to Colby.
Thank you so much, Nick. And Leslie, Rachel, Nick, want to thank you all so much. This is a very complicated topic. As we've covered over the last hour, we could likely go for more and more on some of the different issues that came up. And really, that's the goal of the Lifting the Fog series, is to provide some clarity on these complex topics so that we can all move forward to serve the common good. Again, one more time, we want to thank our speakers today, Leslie Hook, Rachel McMonagle, and our moderator, Nick Turner. Of course, our partners as well at the Seattle Times for putting this conversation together. For our attendees today, we will have a recording of this available to you in your email coming up shortly. And in the meantime, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you for all you do to serve the common good.
Thank you.